Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Mark Carey, Assistant Professor of History in the Robert D. Clark Honors College. Carey specializes in environmental history and the history of science. His interdisciplinary research links many fields, from history and geography to glaciology and climatology. Carey's book, titled In the Shadow of the Melting Glaciers, Climate Change and Andean Society from 2010, illustrates how people in the Andes have grappled with the effects of climate change and ensuing natural disasters for more than half a century. His book won the Eleanor Melville Prize for Latin American Environmental History, awarded by the Conference on Latin American History. Carey's spring 2012 course, Climate and Culture in the Americas, will correspond with a conference. The conference is called Indigenous People, Climate Change, and Environmental Knowledge and will be held at the U of O May 23rd and 24th of 2012. The conference is part of the Indigenous Peoples in the Americas series, sponsored by the Americas in the Globalized World Big Idea. Mark, welcome to UO Today.
Thanks for having me.
We're really pleased to get you here so early in your time at U of O because you're doing such exciting things already.
Thanks.
First of all, is glaciology, is that the correct pronunciation? It's a word I don't know.
Yes, glaciology.
Good,
Correct.
Okay. So how did you end up as a glaciologist?
That's a good question and a kind of a circuitous path that I came to. It goes back to my background of just loving the outdoors and the environment, really, that led me, as soon as I graduated as an undergraduate, to become a park ranger for a few summers. So I was a park ranger at Mount Rainier National Park and Glacier National Park. And there, I didn't really know anything about glaciers when I got there, but I found myself surrounded by them and having to lead naturalist guided walks out to the edge of glaciers and talking about them. And then I just fell in love with glaciers because they move so much. I know we have the expression of glacial pace as being extremely slow. And the thing that I realized starting studying them is they're incredibly dynamic. They move fast, they make sounds, they creak, they groan, they create floods, avalanches, all these things. And camping next to them, you can hear them all night with creaking and moaning and avalanches falling on them. And so I just became really enthralled with glaciers, but thought that was a side project, an interest alongside my fascination with Latin American history. And so I've always been studying Latin American history since an undergraduate. And then I just kind of happened onto the topic in Peru that there was many glaciers there causing severe disasters over the last half century or so, with nearly 25,000 people dying from floods and avalanches, and thought, this is an amazing story here and a tragic story, and it's not been told at all. And I can walk into this knowing a bit about glaciers and also knowing a bit about history and pull these two fields together. And so that's how I came to it, just merging my interest and my academic interests. So.
Your position at the Clark Honors College is as an historian, but You've obviously had to learn a great deal about glaciers themselves and about environmental studies more broadly. How did you fill in those gaps?
Yes, I've had to read a lot of glaciology over the years, and hydrology and natural disaster literature, and it's been fun, actually. It's kind of neat to push beyond our field of specialization and to get that environmental knowledge and to have to read that kind of literature. As a graduate student, I actually took, instead of learning a third foreign language, I actually spent my time studying glaciology and did independent studies with a glaciologist, Kurt Cuffey at UC Berkeley, and I drove an hour and a half down so I could work with him and really learn it, and that provided a good foundation. And since then, I've tried to keep up. Of course, I can't do glaciology. I am a historian. I can't do glaciological research, but I can keep up a bit, and I think it enriches the history and makes it much more interdisciplinary to understand that other side a bit, to be able to know more about glaciers and how they function and how they work and the processes that are going on. That enriches the history quite a bit, I think.
You're really the working exemplar of interdisciplinary approaches in this project you've taken on. I think it must be exciting for your students who are scientists perhaps by inclination, but see you introduce the human element, and also for the humanists who are introduced to real hard science.
Right. Yeah.
Do you find a lot of interest among your students?
I do, and I think the Honors College is a terrific place to be because the Honors College really encourages that interdisciplinary framework, both for research and for teaching. And I find that the courses, I do draw a lot of scientists. A lot of students who are science majors want to take the class, and then they maybe breathe a sigh of relief when we read a paper from Nature or Science from those kind of journals, which I assign in most of my courses. And I think from the other side, people are really fascinated with environmental issues right now. So even if you're a social science or humanities major, then learning a bit more about the science is helpful too. That there's a lot of interest in doing it. It's tough to do, to really merge the two fields, and sometimes I think we're penalized for that in our society, even though there's a lot of rhetoric about interdisciplinarity. There's still an emphasis on your own specialization with your field and how you're measured and which journals you're publishing in and researching. So I think our society has the discourse about interdisciplinary that hasn't quite caught up with actually doing it. But I find it incredibly exciting and fun to do. I have a new grant right now that came out. It's the second year of the grant. It's a 3-year grant with the National Science Foundation. I'm collaborating with a human geographer, a biogeographer, and a glaciologist. And it's the 4 of us around the country working together. And it's been exciting to have these conversations with each other, but also we see how even within a group that really desperately wants to collaborate, sometimes we butt heads a little bit, and methodologically we're wondering about how to do things. And we just submitted an article recently, and to try to narrow it down, it quickly turned into some, it's half a book is what the rough draft was, because we have a lot to say, but narrowing that down. So there's a lot of challenges, but it's a lot of fun.
You're setting a great example with this, and I want to get back to your exceptionally strong student interactive component in this work in a minute, but I wanted to ask you first a little bit more about how you do your own research. So first of all, congratulations on that prestigious prize for your book.
Thanks.
It must have been very satisfying.
Yes.
And how much time do you actually spend in Peru, camped by the side of a glacier or across from one?
To write the book, I was in Peru, that was part of my dissertation research, and so it was about 1.5 years in total that I was there. And it was really split. I spent a lot of time in archives, traditionally where historians go. So I spent a lot of time there reading, but then I also accompanied engineers and scientists and surveyors going up to the glaciers themselves. And so camping out in the mountains and spending time there. And for me, it's a nice mix, right? That goes back to my interests here in the whole project. And I'm not sure which was more challenging. Sometimes at 15,000, 16,000 feet, gasping for air, that's challenging in some ways. But the archives posed challenges too. With archives looked like they were organized by a forklift or a wheelbarrow or something like that, where materials just dumped and dumped and dumped, and a lot of sifting through things. And challenging to find the right materials and find appropriate materials, because this is not a topic that people usually investigated. So showing up in the National Archive, I can't ask for the glacier section, right? It's not organized that way. So lots of extra reading is what it comes down to narrow in and get a sentence or two from long documents that are relevant.
I was really struck by the incredible natural scenery that this leads you to hang out in. There's some spectacular photographs on your website. So that alone must be a pleasure and take you back to your park ranger days.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a beautiful place.
One of the things that strikes me so much since you and I first started talking about your work, Mark, is that you really do insist on inserting the human back into this picture. And I wanted to quote a sentence that struck me from a really great kind of general readership article you wrote on climate change and the consequences in Peru. The line was, "Avalanches and floods only become disasters when they affect people." So a lot of the work you've done is about the human cost of things like avalanches off glaciers causing lakes to flood, correct?
Right.
So what kind of damage has been done? What have the consequences been in Peru?
Yeah, this is a good question to ask about, and I think that, where I position my work is generally, if we think about climate change research on the broadest level, it's mostly about mitigation, meaning how can we stop future warming from occurring? And there's much less, although this is really changing in the last 4 or 5 years, it seems like, there's much less about adaptation or how do humans respond. And so I think that's a key thing, a key area to focus on. And if you think about that disparity between, let's say, the science and technology focusing on mitigation, stopping warming, versus the social science and humanities of the other. The budgets are also very different. Just if you think about the National Science Foundation and its allocation of funds to climate-related research, it would be into the millions or tens of millions, it seems like, or hundreds of millions. It's way up there. National Endowment for the Humanities, almost nothing really would be going to climate-related projects. And that, I think, in part speaks to our societal preferences for what we should have and what we focus on, but it also gets at the interests from people and the complexities, I think, of researchers of examining these social issues. Because on the surface, for my own work, when I first started looking in this region, I could see that nearly 25,000 people had perished in these disasters. But then looking at, okay, how do you respond over time? And even if you know that there's a hazard, what are the restraints on your effective adaptation to that? A lake, you mentioned a glacial lake that could burst and cause a flood. What are the restraints on that? And what I found is that it ends up being much more about social relations and cultural values and power dynamics. And that's a really difficult, much trickier thing to explore.
How do you do that? Do you go into the populations who have been or are threatened by these events and just get the human side of it anecdotally?
Some of it is through oral histories or through interviews with people. I read a lot of newspapers and editorials. I've probably read thousands of editorials over the last 60 or 70 years. Not 60 years of mine, but of research, period. And lots of newspaper articles, government documents, letters that people send to each other. Sometimes I'll use art or poetry or short stories that people have also written to describe the feeling of a flood, for example, and how they convey that in an etching or an artwork or also in a poem, and how they convey that. And that can help get at those views. It's difficult, but I think it's worth doing. There's one of the big issues in Peru right now is about melting glaciers, retreating glaciers, and the implications for water in the future, because glaciers can buffer water supplies year-round, because more water melts out of glaciers in the summer than in the winter, or at least there's a consistent supply of it year-round. In areas where there's no glaciers, there's no summer precipitation, right, in the dry season. And so glaciers then provide summer water. A big concern in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, as well as elsewhere in the world, is that if the glaciers vanish, what will be the future water supply and how will that impact things? And everyone recognizes that that's a concern in the future, and most of the science and most of the studies on this are about how much water will come out, how much is available, when will it decline, and even where could we build reservoirs or things like that. But what I found in my research, looking at 3 examples, and I'll just give you 3 quick examples to illustrate this, is a hydroelectric company. It's a multinational, Duke Energy from North Carolina. They operate a hydroelectric station in the Cordillera Blanca. They've tried to do 3 dams, reservoirs, to help with this regulation of water flow in the year. All 3 of those have been defeated. One, because this is at Auquiscocha, is the name of the lake. It means Lake of the Mountain Spirits, and people just rose up against their presence and said, no, this is a sacred lake. This is one that should not be touched. And they resisted strongly enough to push the company out. Then they went to another lake, Lake Chayap, above the city of Huaraz. That had been drained in the past, in the 50s and again in the 70s, to prevent an outburst flood. So they removed water from it. Then Duke Energy put more water into it to make it a reservoir, and people said, no, historically, this is a threat. We've been trying for a half a century to get water out of it. Now you're trying to put water in it. No, we can't have that. They protested, so Duke abandoned that project as well. Another reservoir, Lake Perón, that they've been at, the people, the local campesinos and people downstream in Cruz de Mayo, and then also in the town of Carras, they felt like it was not being regulated, the reservoir flow, to help with their crops, but also it was infringing on tourism from the looks of the lake, and also just went against their cultural values of how they thought the lake should be managed. So in 2008, they took over the lake, seized control of it, and essentially they've still maintained control of it now, 3.5 years later, it's at an impasse even today. So they've had to resort to kind of a nonviolent but active collective action. And so here's 3 different cases, 3 different lakes where it was not scientific information about how much the climate will change or how much water will come out of a glacier that affected the adaptation strategies. It was all about kind of culture and remembered history and social relations with different groups. And so that's what I think we should be looking at a lot more, getting in there and looking at sociologists and anthropologists and historians and other fields, people really looking at these human stories, because that's where I think a lot of the interplay is going to play out.
You know, I had intended to ask you if you had run into resistance, but it hadn't occurred to me that you would encounter resistance or examples of it in that form. I was curious whether you've had resistance from the corporate side of things and from the government, legislative, political side of things. I haven't experienced people resisting me in particular, and not standing in the way of your research or trying to discourage you.
No, I mean, I think there's always a degree, especially trying to do research. If we could say that my research experience mainly are in Peru and Nicaragua, where I wasn't studying glaciers, that was a different project. But that's I found it challenging to do research there just because facilities and things are set up very differently. The National Archive in Washington, D.C., you walk in, you get your space, you order the documents, and there they are. For me in Peru and in Nicaragua, it was the same thing. It's a series of permissions to get into certain archives where a bureaucrat essentially has to give you that permission. It's beyond the scope of their job, really, but they're not public archives in the way that ours are. And so finding your way into those is tricky. So there may have been more resistance than I even realized was happening, or it really could have just been people are strapped for time and overcommitted and didn't really know what I was working on. But I certainly was not allowed into certain archives. But I didn't really view it as resistance to that per se.
I see your point.
Which is fortunate, I think.
Yes, indeed, and may you continue to go forward without any of that official discouragement.
Right.
I wanted to ask you about the plans for spring quarter, Mark. You've got a lot going on related to this much larger topic. You're teaching the class called Climate and Culture in the Americas, and then you have a conference, a day and a half long, in May as well.
Right. One
of the things that this brings up for me is how very successfully you are involving undergraduates in this research. Can you talk about how successful that has been so far?
Yeah, involving the students is really important to me. And at my previous university at Washington and Lee University where I worked, this is where I started doing that. And it's a liberal arts college, and I was able to bring them in on some of the work related to glaciers in Peru. And I had 3 or 4, I guess 4 research assistants there. Who did a variety of things, from helping build websites to get information to doing research and background literature, and to one student who went to Peru. It was part of his senior thesis. He did kind of a comparative project between Ecuador and Peru, but he did research related to some of these water issues that I was describing in Peru. And so we were able to team up then. And so I was on his thesis committee, but he was also doing the research for me. That I was able to involve in that. And now he and I, along with a graduate student who's working in the region at UC Santa Cruz, we've all co-authored an article that's out there now. So this is a really direct way of bringing the students in to the project. They get their thesis experience. It's a good mentoring process for me. And then we all get to work together to write the article. And and I have the same kind of things going on this past summer here in the Honors College. I hired 4 different students again. And they did a variety of projects, climate change in national parks, to website construction, to irrigation in the lowland areas in Peru, to new work on human glacier interactions elsewhere in the world. And I think that I'm just always really impressed with what students can do. And if you, I think some people think you need to work with graduate students or something. And I found it to not be the case, that undergraduates are so bright and so motivated. And you just toss them an idea, and they really run with it in amazing directions and are so thorough. And I've just had really good luck. And so I've wanted to to keep them involved. And so I get a lot out of this, and I think they get a lot out of this collaboration. And so this led me to think about, for the spring term on May 23rd and 24th of 2012, is to have a student conference, not just for the students that I've personally worked with on my research projects, but to anyone in the class and anyone throughout the university at all, to be able to present some of the work that they've done on climate change. This could be something on a paper they've written in a class. It could be their senior thesis. It could just be a passion that they have, an interest that they have. But the idea is really to focus on the student achievements and what they've done, as well as drawing attention to climate change and Indigenous peoples' issues. And climate change is really, like disasters and many other issues, disproportionately affect the poorest and the most marginalized populations. They have the fewest resources to respond. And so Indigenous people are often overlooked, and they're the hardest hit by these issues. And so I also want to be really, that's one goal in the course, is to really historically, but right up to the present day, draw attention to these issues to make sure that the public knows.
And you have chosen your keynote speakers for the conference accordingly, right? Can you describe who that will be? Right.
We have a couple. One is coming, Daniel Wildcat is coming from Haskell Indian College in Kansas, and he works directly with undergraduate students and at the tribal college and pushes them and helps them get into research on climate change. And our other speaker is a native Alaskan, and he works in activism and consulting, and has been all over the world at major climate change meetings. And so by having an Alaska representative and a continental United States representative, and then the course that I'm teaching and a lot of the student presentations will be throughout the Americas, the idea is to get a pan-Americas kind of vision of climate change and Indigenous peoples from a variety of perspectives and disciplines.
I have a kind of a frivolous question for you that's not necessarily connected to the conference. I recently heard just a fascinating snippet on NPR about an initiative in Peru to paint mountaintops white, both to replace the white of the glacier, and I think it's also an attempt to make the glaciers come back. Is there any scientific integrity to that, as far as you know?
It's a good question, and it's a little bit beyond, this has a lot to do with the albedo, which is the amount of reflection of sunlight off of the landscape. And so I can't get into details on that. On a theoretical level, painting it white would reflect more sunlight, and that allows it to be cooler. And I also saw something on CNN, a little report on that, and they were finding ice in there that hadn't previously been there. There's other examples of putting straw on top of glaciers, and there's notable it actually buffers that and prevents melting. There's other cases where ski resorts, and even on Kilimanjaro, they proposed putting white tarps down. So on the one hand, this doesn't seem like a grand scale kind of adaptation measure. On the other hand, maybe smaller accomplishments. There's a person in India known as the Glacier Man, and he's diverted water in highland areas and created these little mini glaciers that maybe they're not so many, maybe a kilometer or more long and a meter deep or something, and that it freezes and then the water comes out at the right time of year. So he's actively been making glaciers in India. So there could, on a small scale, be something to it, but on a large scale, I think everyone agrees that mitigation of climate change and keeping the greenhouse gases down would be a better long-term solution.
Well, thanks for putting that tidbit into perspective for me.
Yeah.
What else are you working on? Where's this going to go long-term or in the immediate term?
One project that I have right now related to this National Science Foundation grant is to look at water use. But what I'm looking at in particular is not the water up right as it comes out of the glacier, but looking down at coastal industrial agriculture. This has become a really big part of Peru, and Peru's become a leader in asparagus and avocado and artichoke exports. And some of this in the watershed that I work in the Santa River area, it's coming from glacier meltwater in part. So they have a lot of political power and a lot of importance, but they're also, this is a national economy is partly dependent on this. So I'm trying to look at these lower watershed users of water a long ways from the glacier that have not been integral to the conversation because it's people are looking right up next to the glaciers rather than far downstream. But I think in the future, water rights are going to be a huge problem, not just in Peru, but as water amounts fluctuate, it'll be the politics of water rights and water distribution. And so I'm trying to get a sense of these lower down the watershed users. And the Chavimochic project in particular is huge and very efficient and very effective. They've done a really amazing job. But if the water fluctuates, they will be in trouble in a lot of ways.
Do you think that the model you're setting for this kind of work that brings together two disciplines that normally don't overlap very much, is it something you can train a generation of students or those select few who want to follow you to follow in your footsteps?
I think absolutely. I think that it's mostly a question of following your passion and your interests. That's what I've done. So when I'm interested in glaciers, I read about glaciers, and I think it's very doable for people to do. In terms of I think geography programs are pretty good at really training people sometimes to do both, science and social science at the same time. That's not so easy to be experts in both of those fields and mix them together. But integrating in the way that an environmental historian like me, where you read literatures and do that, I think that people can certainly learn that. But it's a question of really following what your passions are and not saying, wait, I'm a historian, I'm not supposed to read this, but going ahead and following that.
Well, last question, Mark. What else do you teach at the Honors College, given you're technically one of their historians?
Right. So far I've been teaching the survey required courses that have us go from ancient history 10, 15,000 years ago up to about the year 1500 in one course, and then 1500 to the present. And what I try to do in these courses is just to emphasize to students how diverse people have interacted with their environments, and look at science and technology as an integral part of those histories. The course I'm finishing now, we really looked a lot at the Mayas, Incas, and Aztecs, and really focus on what they've been able to accomplish a long time ago, and remember that the past history is not just ancient history, as the expression goes, but it really affects our current life too, and how we see people in Latin America and elsewhere in the world. And also some of those achievements have been continued and pushed all along, whether it's the domestication of corn or whether it's Aztec surgery practices, whatever it is, there's broader implications that come right up to now. So I try to get students involved in seeing that and understanding that history.
It's very exciting. I wish I could sit in.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Maybe
Mark.
you
Yes, you know what? That's a really good idea. I should take you up on that. Thank you. And I'll be looking forward to your conference.
Okay.
So thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the conversation.
Good. Thank you. We've been speaking with Mark Carey, Assistant Professor of History in the Robert D. Clark Honors College. Carey's book, In the Shadow of the Melting Glaciers, Climate Change in Andean Society, from 2010, won the Eleanor Melville Prize for Latin American Environmental History. Carey's spring 2012 course, Climate and Culture in the Americas, will take place at the same time as a conference titled Indigenous People, Climate Change and Environmental Knowledge. That will take place at U of O May 23rd and 24th, 2012. The conference is part of the Indigenous Peoples in the Americas series, and that is sponsored by the Americas in the Globalized World Big Idea. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.